What if I told you Africa was carved up like a pie by 7 European countries, in a room full of men who had never even set foot on African soil? No war, no negotiation, just maps, rulers, and raw greed. In less than 20 years, 90% of the continent was stolen. Not with guns, but with pens. The borders they drew are the same ones we live with today, the same lines behind ethnic wars, refugee crises, and deadly conflicts. This isn't ancient history. This is the root of modern chaos. And the world barely talks about it. What if I told you that the borders of modern Africa, the borders that define nations, fuel wars, and divide communities, were drawn by men sitting thousands of kilometers away in Europe with rulers' pencils and barely a clue what they were carving up? That's not an exaggeration. That's not a conspiracy. That is documented history. In 1880, Africa was home to vast, thriving societies, complex kingdoms, ancient trade routes, and deeply rooted cultures. The continent was not unclaimed land. It was not a blank space. It was alive, organized, and sovereign. Europeans had only scattered trading posts along the coasts, barely touching the vast interior. But by 1900, just 2 decades later, nearly 90% of the entire African continent had been claimed, occupied, and divided among 7 European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain. Not one African leader was asked. Not one African voice was heard. The land was taken. On paper, in meetings, in polished rooms in Berlin and Brussels and Paris. They called it the Scramble for Africa, the fastest and most aggressive land grab in modern human history. It didn't start with war. It started with the Industrial Revolution. European factories were hungry. They needed more rubber for tires, more palm oil to run machines, more copper for electric wires, ivory for pianos and luxury, gold, diamonds, coal, timber. Africa had it all, untapped, waiting, as far as the colonizers were concerned. At the same time, a wave of nationalism swept across Europe. It wasn't enough to be powerful at home. You had to show it abroad. Colonies became a measure of status. When Britain claimed territory, France rushed to grab more. When Germany moved in, Italy followed. It wasn't just strategy, it was ego. And now, for the first time in history, European powers had the tools to take what they wanted. Steamships carried troops and guns deep into the interior. Quinine allowed them to survive malaria. And the Maxim gun, the first automatic weapon, gave them firepower African armies had never seen. Still, none of this prepared the world for what happened next. In 1884, European leaders met in Berlin. No Africans were invited. No African governments represented. And over the course of months, they sliced up the continent between themselves like merchants dividing property. Borders were drawn with no knowledge of the people who lived there. Entire ethnic groups were split. Rivals were forced into the same artificial countries. Straight lines cut across deserts, jungles, mountains, and communities that had existed for centuries. They were drawing maps of places they had never visited, claiming rivers they hadn't seen, owning people they didn't understand. It was a theft, not just of land, but of identity. In just 20 years, an entire continent was brought under foreign control, not through diplomacy, but through arrogance and ink. And from that moment on, everything changed. African economies were restructured to serve Europe. Railways weren't built to connect African cities. They were built to move resources to ports. Schools were designed not to educate, but to produce obedient laborers. Systems of governance were destroyed and replaced with foreign rule. Local leaders were exiled, executed, or forced to submit. The colonizers didn't just take control, they erased what came before. In Nigeria, over 250 ethnic groups were forced into one nation under British rule. In Rwanda, Belgian colonizers categorized people based on nose shape and skin tone, creating divisions that would later explode into genocide. In Congo, under Belgium's King Leopold, millions were worked to death for rubber and ivory. their hands severed if they didn't meet quotas. The land suffered. The people suffered. And the effects are still being felt today. These borders, drawn without logic or respect, are the same borders that define African countries today. The same borders at the heart of civil wars, separatist movements, and identity crises. These extractive economies, built for Europe's benefit, are the same systems that many nations still struggle to transform. And the global imbalance of power, with the global South feeding the global North, started here with the Scramble. Yet in most schools, this is a footnote in history. In most textbooks, it's a paragraph. But for Africa, it was the beginning of a century of control, exploitation, and resistance. And if you look closely at today's headlines, from conflict in Sudan to instability in the Sahel to resource deals gone wrong, the ghost of the Scramble is still there. The world was redrawn in conference rooms, and Africa still lives inside those lines. The Scramble for Africa didn't just divide land, it divided people. In many places, ancient kingdoms were split in two. In others, bitter rivals were forced to live under the same flag. The new colonial borders did not follow rivers, languages, or trade routes. They followed European interests, and once drawn, they were enforced with military power. In West Africa, the Hausa people found themselves split between British Nigeria and French Niger. In East Africa, the Somali people were divided across 5 different countries: Somalia, Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and what is now Somaliland. Entire ways of life were interrupted. There was no plan for coexistence, no effort to understand cultures. There was only conquest and classification. In many places, the colonizers imposed identity cards that categorized people based on ethnicity, not to protect them, but to control them. In Rwanda, the Belgians introduced ethnic ID cards, elevating the Tutsi minority while marginalizing the Hutu majority. Decades later, that system would help fuel one of the deadliest genocides of the 20th century. This wasn't accidental. Divide and rule was a strategy. Keep groups competing for favor. Reward one while punishing the other. Create tension. Prevent unity. And beyond politics, Europe re-engineered African economies for its own survival. They built what historians call extractive economies. Economies designed not to develop nations, but to drain them. Mines, plantations, and ports were created not to connect Africans with each other, but to connect African resources with European markets. Gold from Ghana, cocoa from Ivory Coast, rubber from Congo, tea from Kenya, uranium from Niger, all shipped out, rarely processed locally. The wealth flowed one direction, outward. When France colonized West Africa, it introduced the CFA franc, a currency controlled in Paris and still used today by 14 African countries. When Belgium took over Congo, it gave the land not to the people, but to King Leopold himself. A personal colony, a private business, where death was a cost of profit. The colonizers said they were bringing civilization, but what they brought was exploitation on a scale the world had never seen. And what they left behind was worse. When independence movements swept the continent in the 1950s and 60s, many African nations were handed flags, anthems, and ceremonies, but not real freedom. They inherited weak institutions, foreign-controlled economies, and borders designed to divide. They were expected to build modern nations inside colonial cages. And some of those chains still exist. The global trade system still favors the countries that industrialized early, the ones that first colonized. Africa still exports raw materials and imports finished products. Currencies are still pegged to former colonial powers. Debt, dependency, and imbalance persist. And the mindset, the idea that Africa is a place to extract from, not invest in, lingers in boardrooms and newsrooms alike. But something else lingers too. Resistance. From the moment colonization began, Africans fought back. In Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II defeated an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. In present-day Zimbabwe, the Shona and Ndebele people rose up in the First Kimurenga. In Algeria, a brutal war for independence from France lasted 8 years and claimed over 1 million lives. Even when colonizers controlled the land, they never fully controlled the spirit. And today, that resistance takes new forms. Young Africans are questioning the systems they've inherited. They're pushing back against foreign-controlled currencies, unfair trade deals, and the legacies of colonial-era education. They're building tech hubs, launching cultural movements, writing new histories. But to move forward, they must understand what was done. Because the past doesn't stay in the past, especially when the borders drawn 140 years ago still define your country, your language, your economy. The Scramble for Africa was not just a chapter in history. It was the blueprint for the modern world. And its impact is not over. The Scramble for Africa didn't just redraw a continent, it rewired the world. Because once the colonizers realized they could divide and dominate Africa without war between themselves, they applied the same logic elsewhere. Africa became a test case for global imperialism, a blueprint, and the consequences extended far beyond the continent. The same systems used to partition Africa were later mirrored in Asia, the Pacific, and the Middle East. The mentality that powerful nations could carve up the world through diplomacy, force, or deceit shaped international law, trade agreements, and global institutions. When World War I ended, those same colonial principles were used to divide the defeated Ottoman Empire. Britain and France didn't ask the people of Iraq, Syria, or Palestine what they wanted. They drew lines in the sand, just like they had in Africa. The Sykes-Picot Agreement split the Middle East into zones of control, ignoring culture, religion, and identity. After World War II, the newly created United Nations would enshrine many of these power dynamics. While the UN promised equality, its Security Council gave permanent authority to the same colonial powers that once controlled Africa. France and Britain kept their seats. Their former colonies did not. Even modern economic systems reflect this imbalance. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, both created after World War II, have long histories of policies that favor Western interests over those of the global South. Loans tied to structural reforms. Conditions that mirror colonial expectations. Export more, spend less, open your markets, even if it harms your people. This is not accidental. The Scramble for Africa taught the West that domination could be systematized. That control didn't have to look like war or chains. It could look like debt. It could look like trade. It could look like peace on paper, while real power flows in the background. Look at the global trade map today. Raw materials still flow from Africa to the rest of the world. Oil from Nigeria, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, gold from South Africa, food from across the continent. And in return, Africa imports finished goods, often more expensive, often made with its own raw materials. The pattern hasn't changed. Only the players have. Multinational corporations now operate where colonial companies once stood. Western and Eastern powers compete for influence through soft power, infrastructure deals, and resource contracts. And while the flags may be different, the logic is the same. Gain access, extract value, control leverage. But Africa is not passive. Never was. Today's generation is not only aware of the past, they rebuilding a different future. Movements for Pan-African unity are gaining strength. Regional alliances are being formed. Trade blocs like the African Continental Free Trade Area aim to strengthen internal markets and reduce dependency on old colonial routes. Young Africans are redefining what sovereignty really means, not just political independence, but financial autonomy, cultural pride, and technological leadership. And yet, the borders drawn during the Scramble still create friction. Civil wars often follow those artificial lines. Ethnic tensions rise where colonial powers once favored one group over another. Cross-border cooperation becomes harder when infrastructure was never built to connect neighbors. And distrust lingers between communities, between nations, and between Africa and the outside world. So when we look at a map today, we're not just seeing countries. We're seeing choices made by people who had no right to make them. We're re-seeing decisions made in Berlin and Paris and London, decisions that still echo in blood and policy, in poverty and politics. And when a crisis erupts in Sudan, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, we must ask, how much of this is rooted not in failure, but in design? Because the system wasn't built for African stability. It was built for European gain. And until that system is fully understood, it cannot be fully dismantled. Today, when we speak of Africa's challenges, civil wars, weak institutions, corruption, fragile economies, we often ignore the root. The continent was never allowed to grow on its own terms. How do you build unity in a country like Sudan, where colonial borders forced together dozens of ethnic groups, many with long-standing tensions? How do you govern a place like Nigeria, home to over 250 ethnicities, thrown together by British convenience, not cultural cohesion? These weren't nations, they were experiments in foreign architecture. Even language became a weapon. The colonizers didn't just divide Africa, they divided how Africans communicated. Today, West Africa speaks French. East Africa speaks English. Parts of Central Africa speak Portuguese. These weren't native languages. They were tools of instruction, control, and separation. And they still shape diplomacy, education, and trade. Africans often need translators just to collaborate across borders, a problem few other continents face on the same scale. And while Pan-African dreams remain strong, the divisions left behind by colonizers continue to make unity more difficult than it should be. This is the slow violence of empire, not just in bloodshed, but in bureaucracy. Even democracy itself was introduced not as a system of empowerment, but as a tool of control. Colonial powers often handed over power to elites they trusted, not necessarily those chosen by the people. They created systems that looked democratic but were fragile by design. And when independence came, it often came without preparation. Schools were weak. Institutions were foreign. Economies were dependent. How do you govern when the system you inherit was built to serve someone else? That's the reality African leaders faced after independence. And many still face it today. Some tried to break the mold. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. But too often, they were undermined, overthrown, or killed. Sometimes by internal rivals. Sometimes with the help of foreign governments that feared a truly independent Africa. The same nations that colonized the continent didn't disappear after independence. They stayed through trade, military alliances, debt, and diplomacy. Control changed form, but the pressure remained. And still, despite all of this, Africa moves forward. In Kenya, digital banking systems have leapfrogged traditional models. In Rwanda, government investment in technology and infrastructure is transforming cities once torn apart by genocide. In Ghana, young entrepreneurs are creating startups and reshaping the economy. Across the continent, new generations are building futures rooted in local knowledge, global awareness, and historical memory. But progress is not always easy when the world sees you through a colonial lens. Africa is still portrayed as poor, dependent, broken. The media shows conflict, but rarely context. It shows poverty, but not potential. It forgets that the systems holding the continent back were imported, and often still protected, by those who benefit from the status quo. And so, to truly understand Africa today, we must look beyond headlines. We must look beyond charity and aid, beyond corruption and crisis. We must look at how this was all constructed, deliberately, quietly, with maps, with guns, and with centuries of silence. The scramble for Africa was not just a moment in history. It was a method, a strategy of control that reshaped how the world works, who wins, who loses, and who decides. And its legacy is not just found in textbooks. It's written into the laws, the loans, the languages, and the limits placed on people who never agreed to the system they live in. The scramble for Africa wasn't just a land grab. It was the launch pad for a global system that still exists today. It set in motion a world where power flows quietly, not always through armies or flags, but through contracts, currencies, narratives, and networks. Consider how the world reacts when a country in Europe faces crisis. Headlines, sympathy, global aid. Now compare that to how the world responds when conflict erupts in Africa. Often it's met with silence, or worse, a shrug, as if instability is expected, as if suffering is normal. But it's not. It was engineered. When Europe left, it didn't leave a blank slate. It left behind systems that were incomplete, fractured, and foreign. Countries were asked to run governments that weren't built for them, manage borders that made no sense, and fix economies that had been designed to fail without external support. The consequences echo every day, in coups, in refugee crises, in inflation, in political tensions. These are not simply internal African issues. They are the long shadows of foreign intervention. And still, much of the world doesn't see it. Why? Because history has been written by the victors, or at least by those who hold the pen. Colonialism is taught as an era that ended, an old wound, something that happened, then stopped. But that's not how power works. Power adapts. It finds new forms. It speaks the language of investment, of partnership, of security. But often, it's still rooted in control. Look at how resource contracts are signed today. Look at who benefits from Africa's oil, gold, cobalt, lithium. Look at who sets the terms. Who gets protection? Who gets silence? The same countries that once colonized the land now control the commodities. Through multinational companies, foreign banks, international courts. Ownership looks different, but the imbalance hasn't changed. And yet, something is shifting. African nations are rising with a new sense of purpose. Leaders are questioning old arrangements. Citizens are demanding accountability. Technology is giving young Africans tools to educate, organize, and amplify voices once silenced. Movements to reform currency systems. Calls to return stolen artifacts. Pushes to rewrite history books. These aren't just cultural shifts, they are political awakenings. People are asking harder questions. Who drew our borders? Who controls our resources? Who tells our stories? And how do we reclaim what was taken, not just physically, but psychologically? Because the deepest theft wasn't just territory. It was the theft of memory, of agency, of truth. The scramble for Africa wasn't just about geography. It was about control, over how people see themselves and how they are seen by the world. And until that truth is faced, the past will keep repeating itself. But this story is far from over. Across the continent, the next generation is rising, not just to survive history, but to rewrite it. In classrooms, in governments, in art, in technology. They're reclaiming narratives, reconnecting with culture, rebuilding what was broken, and they are not asking for permission. The same continent that was once divided in silence is now finding its voice. What you've just heard isn't just history. It's not just about what happened in the 1880s. It's about right now. It's about the world we live in today, the borders we defend, the conflicts we watch on the news, the wealth gaps no one wants to explain, the systems that feel rigged but no one can quite name. Because history doesn't die. It hides. In plain sight. In policies. In trade agreements. In the unspoken rules of the global game. What happened at the Berlin Conference still shapes Africa's development. It still shapes who has power, who gets access, who tells the story. And until that story is told completely, truthfully, we keep living in the shadow of that silence. That's why I make these videos. To bring you the stories that were erased. The events that were softened, buried, whitewashed. Because the world doesn't just run on money or politics, it runs on memory. And when you control the past, you shape the future. If this video gave you chills, if it made you see the world differently, if it helped you understand something you were never taught in school, then this channel is for you. We don't do surface level. We go deeper, into the systems behind the headlines, into the decisions that never made it into the textbooks, into the roots of power and how they stretch across continents, generations, and identities. So if you want to understand why the world is the way it is and how it could be different, subscribe now. Don't just watch history. Reclaim it. Leave a comment below. What part of this story shocked you the most? What's something you think more people need to know? And share this video with someone who's ready to unlearn and relearn. Because Africa's story didn't begin with colonization, and it doesn't end with it either. This is just one piece of the puzzle. In the next episode, we'll go even deeper into another hidden chapter of history that changed the course of nations. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. So like, comment, share, and subscribe. We're not just telling stories here. We're rebuilding truth, one video at a time.